finding it increasingly more difficult to communicate with my millennial and younger children. And then I had to stop and ask myself, why? Why is there a disconnect between my ideology and theirs, the way I see things and the way they see things? Well, it's obvious. You know, we were born in two different times in society. And I understand that, but that wasn't enough. Where my ideology came from, how was it impressed upon me, and from who and why? So I can go back, and the first person in my lineage that I had significant contact with was my great grandmother, born in 1904, in the midst of Jim Crow. And that definitely had an effect on how she saw the world. My grandfather was born in 1919. And so that great greatly affected the way that they reared and raised and what values and morals they instilled into my father. My father was born in 1950 through just after civil rights. All of the people before me never had freedom, so to speak. I mean, you know, some quasi freedom or some false freedom that they had, but it was all oppressed. All of this oppression is being passed on to me. And now I'm actually born kind of into the first generation that's so-called free. So now all I can get from them, they can't really teach me how to be free. Yeah, they're elated. 22 years and I have my first child. But all my tribulations and all the advice that I got were from oppressed people who really didn't know how to be free. And I had to figure it out on my own. Well, that took a little time. And then I had my children. And then somewhere about 10, 12 years ago, I had an epiphany. And I figured out what I was doing wrong. I was handing off to my children some of the same oppression that my foreparents had passed on to me. Oppression that my children born as millennials wouldn't understand. Against like my parents, my grandparents, and my great grandparents. I didn't get that. But coming up through the early 70s, I could see, because they talked about it so much, I could kind of understand and see some of the remnants passed on to the children in my age from their parents, who were my parents and grandparents' age. So I kind of understood it by the time my children came along. It was really, really hard to detect any type of oppression or racism. You know, my children were clueless about what that looked like. We were in such a integrated world, you know, to where they went to school with all races and nationalities. Not so much the case for me, and definitely not for my parents and grandparents and great grandparents. But so many things went into forming who I am and how I parented my children until the light came on and I had to change some things. Parents, is that we are still trying to process and live through the past transgressions and oppressions, or should I say, the past oppressions of our parents and grandparents. And that just doesn't fly and work in today's world and society. And just like our parents and grandparents couldn't understand us, we find it hard to understand them. But unlike our parents and grandparents, we have the information and the technology to understand and to do something about it. And that's part of the reason why we have such a problem communicating and understanding our children, is because a lot of us, and I was guilty of it at one time myself, didn't stop to understand what had happened to me and what happened to my parents and grandparents, and how I was imposing all of that pain onto my children. Then what it looked like or what I was talking about. And I couldn't understand it for the longest, why they couldn't see what I saw. It's because they didn't live what I lived. And I didn't live what my parents and grandparents lived. But I heard it enough and I old enough, maybe 5 or 6 years old, to see some of the remnants of it. So I had a better understanding of it. Again, my children or our children have no clue what that looks like. You know, my parents and grandparents said a lot of things. They had a whole bunch of rules, not necessarily house rules, but rules to life. And these rules that they had kept them alive during their lifetime with lynchings, kidnappings, and rapes or assaults. You know, my father, my mother, father, at any time during the 50s and mid 60s could have been killed for any reason at all, fun that night. And so my grandparents instilled survival. I guess there would be survival advice to my parents or to my father or to my mother as well. You know, things like walk in groups, stay in groups, don't go here, don't go there. Of course, they couldn't just walk into a McDonald's. I don't even know there were McDonald's. I'm sure there were, but they couldn't walk into a McDonald's or a Woolworths or a Five and Dime. You know, those are the things that I and my children took for granted. I couldn't imagine not being able to walk or go or shop or spend my money where I wanted to. Don't get me wrong. We've all gotten our wake up at some point in time. But our children may get wake ups and don't even recognize that they're getting a wake up. And it's simply because they don't know. A lot of us try to remove ourselves so far from all of that pain that had been handed down to us to where we didn't feel fit or feel the need to explain to our children what had happened to our parents and grandparents, and maybe even to some of us at one time. But that's the problem with our young people, is that we have a problem communicating with them because we think that they got the best of it all, and we try to give them the best of everything that we perceive them to take for granted. But yet and still, we've seen and we've come up through the struggle. Not like our parents and grandparents, but we understand struggle a little more than our children